So the new semester has begun and some of you will be starting your housing projects this time. So I thought it would be appropriate to talk about housing project designs and how one should approach a housing design project as an architecture student. The first thing you need to understand before you start a housing project is that what actually is a group housing project. Why this whole idea came into being, what was the need, how was that conceived in theory, how did the theorists talk about it, how did they come up with this idea, why was there such a huge need of this typology of building after the world wars, and how was it executed on ground. Also, guys, a quick insert. I think it's also very important to understand that the idea of a housing project did happen in theory first. People wrote papers and then there were a lot of discussions in theory, and only then things went on site for construction. किसी ने ऐसे ही अपने मनगढ़ंत आइडिया से इतनी बड़ी बड़ी इमारतें नहीं खड़ी कर दी थी. So there are scholars, there are architectural researchers who work on these things, and this is why as architecture students who are attending college to learn and understand architecture, it's very important for you to understand what is the process of designing and discovering something new. डू नॉट लिसन टू एनी वन हु टेल्स यू कि ये सब तो अच्छी थ्योरी की बातें हैं, इससे कुछ फ़र्क नहीं पड़ता. थ्योरी से ही डिज़ाइंस निकलते हैं और फिर डिज़ाइंस निकलने के बाद वो साइट पे जाते हैं. डोंट लिसन टू दोज पीपल हु मिसगाइड यू लाइक दैट. That said, now there are certain basic texts that you need to read before you start designing a housing project. The first book that you need to refer to is 6,000 Years of Housing. Now, this is a very interesting book, and I think it's a must read for every architecture student, whether they are working on their housing projects or whether they are just working on design and the idea of designing a house as such, because this talks about the evolution of the idea of a dwelling. It starts from the very basic idea of how the tribal people and the nomadic people used to live in the pre-urban house. That's what they call them. And then slowly how urbanization happened and what is the current idea of a house. And it illustrates that in a very detailed and very comprehensive manner. So this is the first book that you need to get your hands on. After that, the next book I would recommend is The Image of the City. Very important text, a must for all architecture students. Again, it tells you about the idea of the imageability of a place, which is a very important aspect of architecture, and another book which you have to pick up and read before you sit down to design. And then we have a pattern language. Now this is a fat book, as you can see, and it's basically divided into three parts, which is towns, buildings, and construction. If you're starting your housing project design, then I would say that you at least should go through two parts of this book, which is towns and buildings. It will talk about a few things which are very important for you to understand before you start designing the project. Apart from these three books, another book which I have already mentioned earlier, Genius Loci. Another book which I have mentioned, I think multiple times before, Genius Loci, Spirit of the Place. That is one book that you need to read, and if not the whole of it, at least the first chapter before you start designing your housing. Apart from this, Complexity and Contradiction is another book which is very important, and all of you should go through that as well. Now, after reading all these books, after going through all this text, you would have a fair understanding and a very mature outlook for what kind of an approach you want for your design when you sit down to design your housing project. The semester in which you sit down to design your housing project is actually very challenging for most architecture students, and it's very understandable because the project is actually kind of unique in its nature. It's unlike anything that you would have designed before this semester, and it will be different from anything that you would design after this semester as well. The biggest difference lies in the fact that the size of the project is unlike anything that you have dealt with before. First year you generally do a residence. Second year you generally do slightly bigger project which will have a significance for the community. It might be a community center or a library or certain projects like that. Third year you generally do projects which are slightly more technical in nature, and then you would start working on your housing project. Now this serves a whole community and not just one particular client or not just a set of people who are in need of something. So you really need to understand the culture of that community, and only then you can serve them properly. Now the problem lies in the fact that it's not a very small project. like the ones that you have done before. And it's not a very big project like an urban design project or an urban planning project or a town planning project, which is of that scale. It is something which lies in between the two, and this is one of the reasons why people find it very difficult to deal with, because this housing project will depend on a lot of things around it which you will have no power to change, and at the same time it will have so many things happening inside it also that you will need to take care of each and everything to come up with a good design. Also, the imaginary client that you will be dealing with for this project is different, because your client is a builder who is working for another client who is his buyer. So the buyer is not one individual, the buyer is actually a whole community. So you are working for a builder who wants to sell it to a community, and that's why it's not a very easy thing to do, because many times the requirements and the needs and the desires of the builder does actually conflict with the needs of the end consumer, which is your community. What is prime here is to understand the people that you will be making the housing for. Why a lot of students fail to deliver for this design is because they do not understand that if they are designing for a lower income group, they need to design it very differently as opposed to the design they would create for a higher income group, because those are two very different sets of society, and they have completely different lifestyles and they follow completely different cultures. So the first thing to understand is actually the lifestyle of the people who are going to come and live there. Now, I know of certain practicing architects who took up certain housing projects and they actually went and lived with those people for whom they were building. I know certain architects who took up projects for housing for certain craftsmen and potters, and in order to understand the way they work and the way they live, they actually went and stayed there for like a week or 10 days and understood their ways of living and then sat down to design for them. So understanding the community and society is prime when it comes to a housing society. Now, all of this said and done, one thing that needs to be underlined and the thing that needs to ride your project is the idea that your design needs to be interesting. It needs to be a fun place to live. No one wants to live in boarding houses. No one wants to spend their lives at the places which do not excite them. And if ever they are trapped in such places, they tend to move and leave those behind. And that is the biggest failure a housing society can ever face. With all of this in place, let us sharply talk about the design approach now. I understand that housing is a project which a lot of people say that it's a very bland and functional project and you don't have much to play with when it comes to concept or anything like that, and your numbers are prime, and if you it's a number crunching game, and if you can't get that right, the whole thing fails. Well, I partially agree with that and I partially disagree with that, because I'll put it very simply. You get your numbers in place, okay? You make as many dwelling units. It's perfect in its function. The circulation is apt. Everything is all right. But now the builder wants to sell it. And when the builder wants to sell it, and if a client comes and if one client looks at the plans and looks at the flashy 3Ds and everything, and if he thinks that it is not exciting him, if they don't like it, if they don't like the way it looks, if it doesn't excite it from that point of view, the client is not going to buy any flat at all. So you may have your numbers in place, you may have your function in place, you may have everything in place which you think is something to be worshipped, and there is nothing beyond that when it comes to architecture. I think it's a very fatal way to go, because if the building does not look exciting, if it does not look good, if it does not have an interesting story to say, no one is going to buy it. So your project, your investment will all go into waste if you do not have a good concept behind it, if you have not designed it interestingly. Think of it in a very simple way. If you were to go out and buy a house, and if the house doesn't look good to you, will you ever buy that house? If you go inside and if you do not like what you see inside it, will you ever really buy the place? You won't. And this is how your client is also going to think. So don't have a very mechanical design process for housing. It is fatal. It is almost criminal to start your design by saying that, okay, so these are the roads that are around the site, and now I will do the zoning, and then now I will decide the building footprint, then I will make the dwelling unit, and then I will make the cluster plan, and then I will build my towers. If you want to do that, you do not need to attend an architecture school for that. You can very well sit at home and you can very well go ahead and do your design that way. You do not need to waste so much of money and so much of your time to do that and go to a design school to create shitty designs like that. Concept is king. If you see any architect's work who has been acclaimed as a master architect anywhere in the world, he will never say कि concept कुछ नहीं होता. As a student, I think you need to understand that concept ही सब कुछ होता है, and you need to develop yourself like that. And okay, fine. Like if you do not aspire to go places in life, if you think that you belong to a small town and then after your graduation you are going to work in a small office, and then you maybe want to run a small office after that, and will always cater to people only around your house and within your city, probably concept kuch nahi hota. But if you are thinking big, if you want to go out and work in a bigger city, and if you want to go abroad and work with the master architects out there, कॉन्सेप्ट ही सब कुछ है. और अगर आप कॉन्सेप्ट नहीं समझ पाएंगे तो आपको कोई जॉब नहीं देने वाला. Now I do understand that it's slightly difficult to pick up a good, appropriate, suitable concept for housing design, but that's your job. You are not in first year anymore. You have spent so many years understanding and learning architecture and design, and now you need to create something good out of that. What I would suggest is that look at very good case studies, look at projects which are acclaimed at a global level, and then understand what they did, why they did, how did they conceptualize, and how did they bring about those designs, and then probably have some kind of sense for the project that you want to do. The image that you create for your housing is very important, and that is something which should always be in the forefront. Once that is understood, once that is done, once that is taken care of, then you bring your functional approach and then you set everything accordingly. But if you straight away go with a functional approach, your design would actually flop. You might pass the semester, but no builder will ever pick up your design and they would never hire you to do that. Alright children, I think this was enough of an orientation talk for your housing design project. If you have any questions, if you want to ask anything more, feel free to drop in comments. I will reply to all of them. And all the best for your design, and keep working. Cheers.